Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, further breaking down the Naz Reid signing, what the Timberwolves cap sheet looks like now, and also what could the trickle-down effect be on the rest of the roster balance, bit of a roster crunch, and what will Naz Reid's role look like this year? He's got to play more minutes, right? How will Chris Finch figure that all out? It's all coming to the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Tuesday, everybody. A packed show today. We're continuing to talk Naz Reid extension fallout, I guess we could call it. And also exciting to announce later who my guest will be on Wednesday's show. So we'll get to that later in the show as well. First of all, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find this one. You can also watch, in addition to YouTube, you can download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV and watch this show and all the other Minnesota Locked On podcasts. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken. That's with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the Naz conversation again today. Of course, the extension reported on Sunday. The Timberwolves did have press conferences for the two draft picks from last week, Leonard Miller and Jalen Clark on Monday. Nothing, I mean, I'm sure you've seen all the quotes out there. Nothing too crazy to talk about on the show today other than both guys talking highly of the new organization and talking highly about their own work ethics, which is always great to hear. And, Jalen Clark, of course, he kind of reiterated he's not playing. Basically, he's not going to be on a court until after the first of next year because of the Achilles tear he suffered several months ago. So those are kind of the main things to take away from that. So I really want to lock back in on the Naz extension, which took place Sunday, or at least was reported on Sunday. Talked a ton about it on Monday, the kind of the nuts and bolts of the deal. So I'm not going to get super in the weeds on that today, but I do want to talk about the impact of the signing on the cap sheet, why it's important that the extension was agreed to now versus after free agency started. And then I want to get into the basketball side from Naz's role. I talked a little bit about this last week, actually, as part of my argument to maybe not re-sign Naz Reid. So I want to revisit a little bit of that, talk about what could the role look like, look at some of Naz's statistics, his numbers from this year, look at some of the lineup data that what's the trickle-down effect, right? Because if Naz is getting paid this money and he's going to get X number of minutes, what about the other guys on the roster? And, what's the trickle down in terms of other guys playing less minutes or maybe playing away from their optimal position when they're on the floor? So we'll get to all that later. First, let's talk about the cap sheet implications. I think this is really important to understand going into free agency. I think one of the main reasons why it was so important this deal was agreed to now, well, obviously the main one is you're not dealing with anybody else on the market. Like I'm sure Naz's agent obviously checked around, probably tried to get a sense for what Naz Reid could make in the open market. I've mentioned Howard Beck mentioned on this show several weeks ago, $15 million. I thought he probably would get at least that. And the Wolves are paying him an average annual value of $14 million on this deal. Naz probably took a little bit of a quote unquote hometown discount, which is one of the reasons why the timing is so important for the Wolves, so that they have a sense for so they know they didn't have to bid against anyone else, right? They were just bidding against themselves and the idea of what some of these other teams could offer. But Naz never actually hit the open market. The second thing is that the Wolves now know what they can and can't do with the other guys on the roster. So they're unrestricted free agents. Like obviously you have to backfill Jalen Noel's minutes. You have, I guess he's really the only unrestricted, but that wasn't a minimum guy. Like, I guess he was too, but he had rotation guy that's an unrestricted free agent. Austin Rivers, obviously a free agent. Nikhil Alexander-Walker, a restricted free agent. And then they've got Taurean Prince, whose contract becomes guaranteed later this week for next year. And then Jordan McLaughlin, who I believe is the 30th, which I guess is also later this week. So both of those guys later this week have contracts that become guaranteed for next season. So this gives the Wolves a little bit more time to figure each of those individual situations out. Actually, so to be clear, the Taurean contract actually becomes guaranteed on Wednesday of this week. So Wednesday of this week, he gets his $7.45 million. So round up to $7.5 million guaranteed. Jordan McLaughlin's contract becomes the 30th. I was right about that. So that's what, Friday? It's Friday the 30th? Yeah. So Jordan McLaughlin's becomes guaranteed on this Friday. Taurean Prince's becomes guaranteed this Wednesday. So it was important to get this done because the Wolves now have a few options in front of them, right? We talked on a previous episode about the possibility, like if the Wolves wanted to keep Naz Reid, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and keep Taurean Prince, but bring back Naz, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and a player to backfill Noel's minutes or whatever. What does that look like? I mean, like Nickeil Alexander-Walker is probably going to get $5 or $6 million on the open market. That's just me based on remember Josh Okogie got a minimum deal from the Suns last year. Nickeil Alexander-Walker is not the defender as Josh Okogie is, but he's certainly a better shooter. And I think people believe he could be a bit more versatile eventually defensively. And there's a little more to his game offensively. I do think Alexander-Walker probably gets $4 or $5 million in free agency. The Wolves don't have a ton of space to bring him back. Like they can. I mean, I have the qualifying offer here. The qualifying offer for Nickeil Alexander-Walker is going to be $7 million. But I don't know, like he's not likely to get more than that annually if he hits free agency or when he hits free agency. So is that the best use of those dollars? But at least now the Wolves know they have this, call it $13 million this year, but an average annual value of $14 million. So whatever that is, $13 million, we'll say this year, tied up in Naz Reid. But that also means they have some of these other options to play with. They could, and again, they have a day now to do this, but they could decide to let Taurean Prince go, to waive him, to cut him, to not guarantee the contract for next year. That frees up almost $7.5 million right there. They could do the same with Jordan McLaughlin, which is only a couple million. So I think they're probably less, unless they've got a couple targets that they truly believe they're going to need those extra dollars, because I mean, they could, but like, it's not the same as a restricted free agent, right? It's not like there's a cap hold. June 30th is the day. Either McLaughlin's got the guaranteed money or he doesn't. So the Wolves they may just kind of say, you know what, let's have the space and figure out the role later and let go of McLaughlin and keep the $2 million. I think the most likely scenario is still that both are on the roster at this time next week. But I think it's more likely that they waive Taurean Prince than they waive Jordan McLaughlin, because you still need a backup point guard. And Jordan McLaughlin, the good version of McLaughlin, is worth what's essentially a vet minimum contract. There's really no major upside to jettisoning Jordan McLaughlin at $2.3 million and still needing to find a backup point guard. Now, if you find someone that's better than him and you can move on from him later in a trade or whatever, fine. But at least you have the security of you have a good, at times good, and at the very least, a decent playable backup point guard to Mike Conley. So all that to say, I think it's more likely that Prince is off the roster at the end of the week than Jordan McLaughlin. But either could happen. So we'll get into the rotation itself later, but this roster it needs to be balanced. And the Wolves now have some clarity because Naz Reid is under contract. They know who their top 7 guys are. They now need to make decisions on the McLaughlin and Prince contracts. Are they going to be aggressive in trying to bring back Nickeil Alexander-Walker? How are they going to fill the role left by Jalen Noel? And then beyond that, you've really only got 1 or 2 roster spots, depending on what happens with rookies, Nate Knight, Austin Rivers. You've got your 2 ways, sure. But this is at least the biggest chunk of money the Wolves are going to hand out. It's now been handed out. They know who their backup big is. They don't need to worry about that. They've got Nate Knight as their 4th big if they want to keep him at a couple $1 million, essentially the minimum as well. So it at least frees up some bandwidth for the front office and gives you some cost certainty moving forward when free agency opens in a few days, for the Wolves to kind of like know, hey, here's what's set in stone and here's what we still need to figure out. I do want to get to the rotation, and actually we'll do that at the end of the show, because in between, I think it's important to talk about Naz Reid's potential role this year, and that'll kind of bridge the gap to, like, we talked about the salary cap situation. Now let's talk about Naz's role. Then let's talk about the actual rotation, depending on what Naz's role is, and like, what's this going to look like? What tiers is this rotation in? What does the roster balance look like? What are the questions that first Tim Connolly in the front office has to answer, and then eventually Chris Finch has to figure it out? He's the one that's got to figure it out when it's all said and done, when the offseason is over. So we'll talk about all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at eBay. For a championship team, eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to my garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Every dayers, very exciting. Tomorrow, Wednesday's show, scheduled to have the one, the only Howard Beck on the program. It's been nearly 6 weeks since he was on last. Lots to talk about. Excited to discuss the Naz Reid re-signing, get his take on it from a national perspective. What was the value the Wolves got? What could the trickle-down effect be to the potential for a Karl-Anthony Towns trade? Is there any correlation there? Or, what do the sharks in the water look like? Are there teams thinking that they're after Cat or have a shot at getting Cat? We may talk a little bit about the kind of the conundrum we're discussing today, which is what do the Wolves do with Prince and that roster spot? So we'll cover all that with Howard Beck on Wednesday. He's scheduled to be on the program, of course, formerly of New York Times, Bleacher Report, plenty of different publications, SI, Sports Illustrated. And just a longtime phenomenal national basketball writer. So excited to have Howard back on the show on Wednesday. All right, continue the Naz Reid conversation. Let's talk about Naz Reid's minutes. And I said this a week or two ago, and I was actually, I knew that Naz didn't really consistently play a ton, even after the Towns injury, but to really look at it was very surprising. Naz Reid last season only averaged 18.4 minutes per game. Karl-Anthony Towns missed 53 games last season. Rudy Gobert missed 12 games for that matter, for a variety of reasons. So how does Naz not play? And now I know Naz also missed the last couple months or 6 weeks or so of the season anyway, 4 weeks. But Naz Reid still ended up 11th on the team in minutes per game. Naz Reid ended up 7th on the team in total minutes played. He only averaged 18.4 minutes per game last year. And I said this on the show on Monday. Over the first 20, what was it until Towns got injured? He got injured in that Washington game right after Thanksgiving. So if I can get this thing to work. Towns got injured in game number 21. Okay. Through the first 21 games of the season, Naz Reid only appeared in 15. He missed 3 with back spasms or something like that, but he had 3 did not play coaches' decisions. And in the 15 games that he played, he only averaged 12.9 minutes per game until Towns was hurt. So pre-Towns injury, best case scenario, Naz Reid was playing 13 minutes per game. Okay. Obviously Naz gets hurt in, I guess it was only the last 5 games of the regular season that Naz misses. And after Towns came back, Naz was averaging still around 20 minutes per game. So we can use that as a loose blueprint for okay, this is generally what we think, Naz's minutes load could look like next year. So just to pull a random game, relatively random from the end of the season. This is March 22nd. The Wolves beat the Hawks by 1, and all 3 of these centers were healthy. Rudy Gobert played 33 minutes. Karl-Anthony Towns played 26, was in a little bit of foul trouble, had 4 fouls on the night. Naz came off the bench, played 25 minutes, and had 26 points on 15 shots and 8 rebounds. So Naz had 26 and 8 off the bench, played 26 minutes. Towns played 26 minutes. Gobert played 33. But again, that was at least in part due to Naz Reid foul trouble. The next game, the Timberwolves played against the Warriors. Towns avoided foul trouble. Gobert did have 4 fouls, but Gobert played 34 minutes. Towns played 32. Naz played 21. This is a more typical minutes distribution that I think we can look forward to next year and plan to see. And no doubt the Timberwolves coaching staff and front office looked at games like this. This, by the way, was a Timberwolves win as well, 99-96 over the Warriors on March 26th. Rudy plays 34, Towns plays 32, and Naz plays 21. Naz still off the bench manages to put up 23 and 6, 10 of 17 shooting. Towns only had 14 and 5. Gobert had 10 and 18 in this game. Naz was actually the Timberwolves' leading scorer off the bench. So these two games that I just pulled are two of the games that the Wolves no doubt looked at and were like, oh, well, Naz could play with the starters. Naz could play this. Now, even after Towns came back, like for the most part, Naz was still averaging around 20 minutes per game, like I mentioned a minute ago, 20, 21 minutes per game. And there was that stretch he averaged basically 18 and 5. The rebound numbers weren't super impressive, but he was still the primary bench scorer for the Wolves. And I think there's going to be so much on Chris Finch this year to try and figure out how these minutes stagger in the rotation. And you absolutely have to assume that Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert are each going to average somewhere around 30 minutes per game, right? And more than that, it's probably going to be 32 to 34 minutes per game. And if you look at the 4 and the 5 and you assume that Rudy's playing, like, I'm just throwing out, like, not completely made up numbers, but basically made up numbers. So say Rudy's playing 32 minutes at center and Towns is playing, all of his minutes are going to be at center, and Towns is playing at least 2/3 or 3/4 of his minutes at the 4. And Towns is playing the remaining, call it 14 to 16 minutes at center. That only leaves, like, this is ballparking it, but 25 to 30 big man minutes. And Naz is going to play most of those. So how does that look, right? Is it Rudy's playing 32 minutes at center and Towns is playing the other 16, but then Towns is also playing 16 at power forward, which leaves 32 minutes at power forward? Okay, so I said 25 to 30, so maybe I undershot it a little bit. So that means that Naz is going to play the majority of those 32 minutes at power forward, which leaves, call it, if he's playing 20 to 22 minutes, 12 to 16 minutes. Who else is on the roster? That's what I want to get to next. Kyle Anderson, Jaden McDaniels, Taurean Prince. These are all guys that have played minutes at the 4 for the Wolves over the past several years. So what's the trickle-down effect on the rest of the roster? And also, what's the compatibility level of Naz Reid if he's playing at the 4 with some of these other lineup combinations? So, for instance, I went and I looked. I mentioned Naz Reid lineup data in terms of two-man lineups in the show on Monday. And if you look at Naz's two-man lineup data, I talked about his issues on the floor with Gobert and his issues on the floor with Towns. So quickly, his second worst lineup combination last year, two-man Naz's, was Rudy Gobert, minus 12.7. His sixth worst was Karl-Anthony Towns, a minus 7.3 net rating. But with Jaden McDaniels, who oftentimes this was Naz playing the 5 and McDaniels playing the 4, but not all the time, 579 minutes was a negative 0.4, which actually, this was Naz's second best lineup. Naz Reid only had one positive net rating two-man lineup. If you take out Garza, Minot, and Matt Ryan, which are all limited minutes, his only positive two-man lineup was Jordan McLaughlin. His next best was the minus 0.4 with Jaden McDaniels. So there's a couple different ways we could look at that, but let's look at it this way. Naz at the 4 and McDaniels at the 3, that's a really big lineup. It helps you from a switchability standpoint because McDaniels can cover for Naz and he's so versatile, but that trickle-down effect there, again, we'll talk about this in a minute, but Taurean Prince, Kyle Anderson, what does that do to their minutes, and what's the compatibility of these lineups together? And looking at the 5-man lineups, there wasn't a whole lot to glean from that either. I mentioned this on Monday as well, but like the Naz 5-man lineups with him not at the 5 are few and far between because he didn't do much of that last year. Obviously, he did it when Towns was out, but it was still a relatively small window of time in which Naz was healthy, Towns was out, and Naz was actually playing, significant minutes at the 5 because Rudy was still playing heavy minutes himself. So all that to say, what's the compatibility of the various Timberwolves lineups with Naz at the 4, Rudy at the 5, or Cat at the 5 and Naz at the 4, and other threes? We just don't have enough data to like really know for sure. And also the Towns Reid data of them on the floor together is pretty limited too. They haven't played all that many minutes together, even though they've been on the same team now for 4 years. It's very, very limited. In fact, if you want to go back to last season, by last season, I mean the 21-22 season, Naz and Towns together only played 84 minutes on the floor together. That's crazy. And they were negative 10.3, by the way. So Naz and Towns together, it was actually the only players that Naz Reid played less minutes than in 21-22 were Leandro Balmaro, Nate Knight, McKinley Wright, and Greg Monroe. Okay? That's how few minutes Naz and Towns played together in the first full year of Chris Finch at the helm. And Chris Finch is somebody who wants to play big, right? Like he likes playing big. Go back even 2 years, right? So now we're talking the 2021 season. So the second COVID shortened year, Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels rookie year, Naz and Karl-Anthony Towns played 160 minutes together and were a negative 2.4, which, by the way, was still Naz's second best, or this was Naz's second best lineup, 2-man lineup. It's Karl-Anthony Towns and Naz Reid played the least minutes together of any of Naz Reid's pairing because, again, Naz was often Karl-Anthony Towns' backup, or has been. So there isn't a whole lot of chemistry, at least not that we've seen, between Naz and Towns. But again, on the bright side, the sample size is painfully small. So this is a lot like what we said last summer about the Rudy and Towns pairing. Like, we don't know if it'll work. We don't know that it won't. We can say the same thing about Rudy and Towns now because they only played, 29 games together this year. We don't know if Naz and Towns are going to work together either. There's just a lot of experimentation going on with this roster. And to that point, I want to talk about the aforementioned trickle-down effect of Taurean Prince, specifically Taurean Prince and Kyle Anderson, but also Jaden McDaniels. What happens to the rest of the roster? What does this thing look like as now Naz Reid is getting paid like he is one of the team's best 6 or 7 players, which I think he is. So what does that do to the rotation? We'll talk about that here next. All right, the trickle-down effect of the Naz Reid re-signing on the roster. The Timberwolves starting lineup this year undoubtedly is Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert. Those are your starting 5, your top 5. Who are the next 2 players on the roster, rotation-wise? Well, Kyle Anderson, you would say, is your 6th man. He started a bunch last year because of the Towns injury, but he's your 6th man. And then it's Naz Reid. That's your top 7. You don't get any other choices. That's your top 7. Taurean Prince, you could argue, but he also doesn't have his contract guaranteed yet. Nickeil Alexander-Walker is a restricted free agent. Jordan McLaughlin had a rough end of the season. His future's in question a little bit. That's your next tier, right? That's your next grouping of players. And then you get into Josh Minott and Wendell Moore Jr., last year's rookies. We don't know what their roles will be. You have this year's rookies. Austin Rivers is a free agent. Matt Ryan's a free agent. The two-way guys, Matt Ryan, Luka Garza are free agents. Nate Knight is in there as well. But unquestionably, your top 7 are Conley, Edwards, McDaniels, Towns, Gobert, Naz Reid, and Kyle Anderson. So they're all, other than Conley and Anthony Edwards, they're all 4s and 5s, basically. I know McDaniels is primarily going to play the 3, but none of those guys, like in your top 7, you don't have a backup point guard. You don't have a backup 2 because Jalen Noel is potentially or very likely gone. Nickeil Alexander-Walker might be gone. He's also a free agent. Jordan McLaughlin, question mark. So number one, you obviously the Wolves need to add some depth there. You need to backfill the Noel minutes. You need to backfill the Alexander Walker minutes. The question mark surrounding or above Taurean Prince's name. So that's number one. Number two, what does that mean about Taurean Prince? Does this mean he gets squeezed out? Because McDaniels is primarily going to play the three. Prince's best minutes are typically as a small ball four. That's what we've seen over the past couple of years. Alexander Walker would be your backup too. He ended up taking a lot of those Jalen Noel minutes late in the season. So that gives us some direction for what the Timberwolves have to look to do in free agency. But in my mind, it also suggests that maybe the Wolves do move on from Taurean Prince. It doesn't necessarily mean that they waive him this week and that they do not guarantee his contract. I don't know that it means that. They could always bring him back and trade him later, right? His contract becomes guaranteed in a couple of days. That doesn't mean they can't trade him later this offseason. And his contract's affordable, less than $7.5 million. That's not a crazy number for a guy that shot almost 40% from three last year, has a reputation as a good team defender. I think he slipped a little defensively last year and he struggled on the glass. So I wonder what his role is on this team moving forward. But he's going to have at least, I don't know, I don't want to say trade value, but he will be tradable on that contract moving forward. So the idea of keeping Taurean Prince and then trading him isn't crazy. I talked about some free agents last week, and we'll get more into that next week as well, and actually really the end of this week because it's like free agency is about to start again. But the Wolves need to look at shoring up the 1 and the 2, whether it's more of a point guard like a Javon Carter from Milwaukee, or more of a scoring guard like a Seth Curry to shore up the bench to take on the Jalen Noel role. And also play some minutes with the starting rotation and spread the floor, et cetera. Those are two of the targets that I like that I think could fit in nicely. But this Wolves rotation is now very front court heavy. And it seems obvious. And there's the whole the Wolves tied up $105 million this year in centers. Haha. Yeah, they did. But now also effectively 4 of their best 7 players are best cast as 4s and 5s. I mean, Kyle Anderson can play the 3, but he hasn't been really successful as a small forward since very early in his career. His best minutes ever have always been at the 4, San Antonio, Memphis, Minnesota. So realistically, Kyle Anderson, going back to the second segment of today's show, loses out on some of those minutes at the 4 and is forced to play the 3, which is out of position. Now, what does that do to Taurean Prince? If you're pushing Kyle Anderson to the 3, you're pushing Jaden McDaniels is already playing the 3 because your 4 minutes are Towns and Naz. Where does Taurean Prince fit in? You don't want him to play the 2. I mean, you can for a few minutes here and there in a giant lineup, but Kyle Anderson is a better player than Taurean Prince. So I worry a little bit about you'd be getting some suboptimal Kyle Anderson minutes. You lose the Taurean Prince role entirely. And you have to backfill those minutes at the 2 with somebody that is as good or better than Taurean Prince. And so that's kind of where I think the Wolves are at. They have to figure out, how does this all fit together? How confident are we in Kyle Anderson shoring up those 3 minutes? Can we find him enough minutes at the 4? Can we find Naz enough minutes at the 4? And then where's Taurean Prince's role? So the more I've kind of thought about this and mulled this over and kind of done the math minutes-wise, I wonder if Taurean Prince has a role in this team next year because he is best cast as a 3 that can play the 4, not a 3 that can play the 2 or a 2 that can play the 3, right? And that 3 role is all Jaden McDaniels, and now it's Kyle Anderson. And yeah, McDaniels is foul prone, and so obviously you need depth. You've also got Josh Minott, who's a 3 that can play the 4. I would say a very similar kind of cast in a similar type role in that regard. You've got Wendell Moore, who obviously helps in terms of backcourt depth at the 2. Then you've got this year's rookies too. Now Jalen Clark's not going to play, and I would be shocked if Leonard Miller played much at all early. But roster balance is the thing, and we're going to have to keep track of that. Tim Connolly has built himself a very top-heavy roster, and I don't mean like stars and scrubs necessarily, but I mean in terms of 4s and 5s. You could throw McDaniels in there too. He's more of a 3, obviously, but your top 7 players, only 2 of them are guards. Maybe is the best way to say it, right? only 2 of your top 7 players are guards, and one's Anthony Edwards, who's as big as a lot of small forwards, right? So you got to find some backcourt depth, and that could squeeze Taurean Prince out of the mix in Minnesota if they want to use those dollars to go get a Seth Curry or to get a couple of options in the backcourt, which is another direction they could go. So keep an eye on this the next couple of days. We'll keep an eye on whether or not Taurean Prince gets his contract guaranteed, and then later on Friday we'll find out about Jordan McLaughlin. Obviously, a much smaller dollar amount, but that's the other one that comes due here this week. All right, that's all we have for you today here on the show. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we're scheduled to have Howard back on the show Wednesday. Very excited for that, and then also later this week, likely doing a crossover with another team to discuss some Karl-Anthony Towns possibilities, teams that are interested in Karl-Anthony Towns, and if there's any appetite on the Wolves side for that. So we'll get to that later this week too. And then we're in a free agency. Like it's happened. And then it's summer league. Like there's so much to talk about. And we're still daily here, Monday through Friday, through the rest of July and into August. Or I guess through the month of July and into the start of August. So be excited about that. There's plenty to cover here at Locked On Wolves. A big thank you to those that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, you can, of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.